Hey folks, well this time around I wanted to talk about namespaces. All semester long in our programs we've been writing this using namespace std as one of the first couple of lines of our programs, and we haven't really gotten into what that actually means or what its purpose is or what some of the implications of that happens to be. So the idea is that in C++ we can take a set of definitions and group them together and give that entire collection of definitions a name. So this is referred to as a namespace. It's a bunch of things that are defined as part of a specific collection. So these things could be constants, variables, data types like structs, functions. So anything that's defined in this collection is part of the namespace. We can even expand it later on if we want to, so we can add more things to the namespace later in a different part of the program, or in another program for that matter that happens to include the namespace that we created earlier. Now, we can have lots of different namespaces that we're making use of, and each of them has their own sets of definitions. So it's possible that, I've got some constant size that's declared in one namespace. I don't know, maybe it's as a long that's got, value 80, and in another namespace with that same name, it's declared as a different data type int with some different value, 256 or something. So, the different namespaces are, if you like, completely separate. They can each make up, their own names and their own data types and their own values, and it's totally fine. We can pick and choose which namespaces we want to use at any given point in time. We just have to make sure that for anything that we're using, we know what name it has and which namespace it's coming from. So if I'm using the size constant, then I just have to know which namespace I'm picking to get that size from. So we'll look at a variety of different ways that, we'll look at how to create namespaces and how to extend them, and we'll also look at how to pick and choose which things we want from which namespaces. And there's a few different options for doing that. All right, to create one, it's easy. You use the word namespace and then whatever name you want to give your collection of definitions. And then inside the curly brackets, you give all the different definitions, the variable definitions, the function definitions, whatever it is you want to create, you define between those brackets. So again, this has created the new namespace. Later on, you can have another chunk of code that extends it. So, I could go through and create my namespace, for instance, CS160. And I decide, okay, well, I'm going to, for my 160 namespace, I'm going to want a definition of a line length. I'm going to want a definition of a struct for integer arrays. So you decide what things you want to go into that namespace. And then later on, if you want to extend it, you just use the exact same syntax, namespace CS160, and then the new things you want to add. Right? So I can go through and say namespace CS160 and maybe create a float array struct. Right? So I can keep adding to this definition anytime I want. Now, at some point, we're going to want to be able to use the things that were in the namespace. So the way you refer to something specific is by using the name of the namespace, so for instance the CS160, and then the name of the thing inside it that you want to use. So if I wanted to use that float array struct, right, so it was in CS160 and it was called float array, or float R, I specify CS160, the 2 colons, and then the float array. And this is saying the definition of float array comes from inside the CS160 namespace. And then, I can create my variable x that's of that data type. So x is one of these structs of float arrays. Now, the nice thing about this is that if I'm reading the code, I see the specification of what namespace float array is coming from. So if I want to look up the definition of float array, if I want to look up the details of the fields and all that kind of thing, I can go into the CS160 namespace and find it. So this is very clear to whoever's reading it. Now, the downside to that is that, sometimes these names can get kind of lengthy, and if I've got, some namespace of blah, 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 if every time I'm using things inside it, I'm doing blah, 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 colon, colon, and then X or something like that, or whatever the definition is, then it can wind up taking up a fair amount of just visual real estate when you're reading your code. So programmers will sometimes go with a shorthand where up at the top of your program you say using, and then you'd identify the namespace and which piece of it you're using. So CS160, for instance, using CS160 float array. That would mean that at any point in the rest of the program, I could just use the word float R without having to include the CS160 colon colon every time. So at the top of your program, you've got a list of which of these specific definitions you're using, which namespace, which definition, and then in your code, you just go ahead and use the name. So if I said using CS160 float R, then in the rest of my program, I can just use float R instead of the CS160 colon colon blah. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages. If I just see float R in the program, it's not clear to me where that definition is coming from. But on the other hand, it is a lot shorter than writing CS160 colon colon float array. So trade-offs. As everything, there's always a trade-off. The even bigger shorthand that we've been using so far is to just say, well, just give me everything from that namespace. So I could say using namespace CS160. And after that, I could just simply use any of the names, any of the definitions from CS160 without needing to include the CS160 colon colon in them. So this is saying I'm going to just give me all the definitions from it. So that means that it is simpler when I'm writing my code. I don't have to include the CS160 colon colon all over the place. The downside is that I'm probably not using a lot of the names from that namespace, a lot of the definitions from that namespace. So if it happens to define something that I also want to use, there's a name conflict there. And also when I'm reading the code, it's not obvious, if I'm looking at some data type that's in use or some item that's in use, it's not obvious to me from looking at the code whether or not it came from CS160. I don't know if it came from CS160, or I don't know if it was something that was defined within the program itself, within the current chunk of code somewhere. So I've got a choice of either searching off through the program to see if it was defined here somewhere, and then if not, assume it came from the namespace, or I'm just kind of stuck at that point. So there are downsides to it. We've been using that notation, using namespace std to grab everything from the std namespace, which is pretty big. Most of the common C++ class libraries add things to that namespace. So it is a little clunky for us to be using that, and it would probably be cleaner if we actually identified, if we at least went with this syntax where we specified which things from std we were using. For instance, if we said using std colon colon cin, using std colon colon cout, using std colon colon endl, that kind of thing where we could list out which specific definitions we wanted. That would probably improve the maintainability of the code somewhat. So there are trade-offs to all of these choices, but I did want you to be aware of what the namespaces are doing and what the implications have been for that using namespace standard that we've been going with. All right, I will leave that one there.